Kia ora everyone, good evening, and wherever you are, welcome to the Christian World Service Supporters Council Programme meeting on the 30th of October 2020. Some of us are here in Christchurch at the Aldersgate Centre, and there are many of us, approximately 30, who are in other places, and I can see some small pictures of them. I'm very pleased that you're able to join us through technology, and I'm particularly pleased that our guest speaker is one of the people that we have on the screen ready and waiting. Hello, Professor David Toombs. I'll come back to you in a moment. My name's Ian Lothian, and for one more day I'm the chairperson of the board of CWS. And I'll retire out with the old and in with the new tomorrow at the AGM. However, more of that later perhaps. What I'd like to do is just spend a moment or two welcoming everyone and acknowledging all of the different people who are able to join us. First of all, to all of our supporters here and elsewhere, welcome. We value your support, all the different kinds of support you give us at CWS. Our partner churches who are represented here and I'm sure elsewhere, we very much value the long-term relationship we have with our partner churches. In our organisation here in Christchurch, our National Director, Pauline Mackay, I've thanked Pauline once tonight for organising this event. I'll thank her again now. Well done, Pauline, and thank you. And the staff who work in our office here in Christchurch and also in Auckland, I'd like to acknowledge them, staff and volunteers. And without them, we could not do very much. Members of our International Programmes Working Group. And as well as the board members who are here, and I can introduce them, and I'd like to do that. But before that, I'd like to mention that we have board mentees, people who have been brave enough to join us and to work with our board. And the official title for the programme is Action Against Poverty, Decision Makers Mentoring Programme. We borrowed the idea from the Institute of Directors and they haven't complained so far. And it's meant that over the last 2 to 3 years, 3 people with tremendous skills have joined us in our board meetings. They've challenged our thinking, they've brought new ideas, they've volunteered and done work, and it's just been fantastic to have the 3 of them involved. There's Felicity Jansonius, who's in Auckland, and she's done work in the Auckland office through that time. We also have Gaia Maridati, who's here tonight, making sure that all the technology works, and she's waving to the universe now. So, hi Gaia. And then we have Kate Boardman, who started off as one of our mentees. She was one of the first, and after a while, people began to say, why isn't Kate a member of the board? And when the board heard that, we kind of looked around and said, well, we can't think of a reason why not. So Kate's joined the board as a board member, and she's over there. If you'd like to stand and wave, Kate. So as I step down tomorrow, there will be 3 new people coming on board. I was obviously doing the work for more than one person. Not really. But the new chair will be Sally Russell. And Sally may be on Zoom? I don't know. Not sure. Anyway, Sally is an existing board member and she will take over as the chair from the time of the AGM tomorrow. Tara Tautari? Tara?
No, Tara is tied up.
Tied up? Fine. Good excuse. And Faye Tevi. He's...
Well, I don't know where the Faye's coming on. He's based in Fiji.
Fiji, okay. I'm working through all the people who might not be here. Now, Jonathan Fletcher, he's here. Yes, very good, Jonathan. And Jill Hockey. Hey. Jenny Smith, Who?
Ginny's an apology.
An apology. Kate I've mentioned. And to our 3 new board members, all from Auckland. First one, Edmund Fehoko, sitting at the back. Welcome, Edmund. Georgina Kingsley-Smith. Yay. And John Bergen. Welcome to you all. I think I better introduce very briefly our guest speaker. Our speaker tonight is Professor David Toombs. And David is a lay Anglican theologian and the Howard Patterson Chair of Theology and Public Issues at the University of Otago. His work addresses religion, society, and ethics, and he has a long-standing interest in contextual and liberation theologies. His current writing focuses on crucifixion. Originally from the United Kingdom, David previously worked at the University of Roehampton in London and at the Irish School of Ecumenics, Trinity College in Dublin. I'd like to welcome you, David, and say how grateful we are for you speaking with us tonight, and we very much look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Ian. Kia tātou. It really is a great pleasure to be with you this evening, and many thanks to Ian and Pauline for this invitation to speak on this subject, which, as you will have heard in that introduction, is one which is dear to my heart. And what I hope to do is offer some ideas on how liberation theology might offer some thoughts for looking to the future. It is a subject of personal interest, and I'm looking forward to what you have to say on it in the Q&A which is to follow. As a quick outline, bear with me while I get the slide advanced. Here we go. As a quick outline, what I'll be doing for about 30 minutes is first to offer a brief overview of Latin American liberation theology as a movement which arose from a moment. Second, I'm going to be suggesting some of the theological insights, 10 insights in fact, from liberation theology, which I think remain important legacies, even though the movement has waned. Third, I'll be identifying some of the signs of our contemporary times, which call for a theological response and our attention. And fourth, I'll present 3 questions offered by liberation theology, which might help us face this present and help us in transforming the future. So, to start with liberation theology, and a very brief sketch, and I realise some of you will be very aware of this material, may have been actively involved in some of these developments and certainly some of these discussions, and for others it's perhaps less familiar or it's more distant past. So I won't be saying very much, I will be just looking to give a fairly brief overview. We'll start, and I'll divide this up into the 4 decades, which I think are most important, starting in the 1960s. We can think of 1968 as the birth of liberation theology. So we're going back just a little over 50 years. And this is what I think of as the decisive moment for liberation theology. For most of its history, the church in Latin America, the Catholic Church, had been conservative. Yet in 1968, there was a sequence of decisive points where it turned to social justice and a commitment to the poor. And this reorientation, or some would call it a conversion even, of the church, involved a number of things. A turn from charity to justice, a turn from development to liberation, and a turn from thinking about social misfortune or thinking in terms of social misfortune to thinking in terms of systems and social oppression. Now, there were lots of previous backgrounds prior to 1968 that liberation theology drew on and which made this moment possible. We can't list them all, but certainly amongst them would be the long history of Catholic social teaching dating back to 1891 and the encyclical Rerum Novarum. The much more immediate history of Vatican II between 1962 and 1965 in Rome. And that was, as it were, the immediate prompt for one of the key events that gave rise to liberation theology. But then there was also another important document, Populorum Progressio, in 1967, which also gave spur and energy and encouragement to the movement. And then in 1968, 3 critical meetings in rapid succession, with different key actors in the Catholic Church coming together and making similar commitments which built on each other. First of all, the Jesuit provincials at Rio de Janeiro in Brazil in May. Then a hugely significant address by the Peruvian priest and what the person many would see as the founder of liberation theology, Gustavo Gutierrez, to priests and laity at Chimbote in Peru in July. And then, and perhaps the big one, certainly as far as the institutional church was concerned, the bishops' meeting at Medellin in Colombia in August. And that meeting of the Latin American bishops was a direct response to Vatican II, where the bishops had been present in Rome listening to many of these discussions, but had decided very quickly that they needed their own meeting back in Latin America to really think through the implications of the council and what it was saying to them and their reality in Latin America. Now, I've suggested initially that it's appropriate to think of this moment giving rise to this movement. And I mean by movement at least 2 senses. First of all, liberation theology involved both a social movement, a transformative social process within both the church and wider society, and a distinctive theological concern and theological approach. It was both and. It was both a social movement and a movement in thinking and ideas, and it was those 2 things going together and supporting each other, which was so important. And then secondly, it's movement in a very different sense, that these ideas and this movement in the church didn't stay static. They were in turn developed over time and refined in coming decades. So the moment of 1968 then gave rise to this movement that followed through and developed in subsequent decades. Now, I should add, before we start tracing those subsequent developments, that although these shifts are very real, they were never easy, and there were always some in both church and in society who were strongly opposed to them. So I don't want to give an impression of liberation theology as this unstoppable force that everyone agreed with. It was remarkable that it did develop a consensus behind it and get significant institutional approval and buy-in, but there were always those who resisted it and hoped to bring it to an end. Let's move on to the next decade, the 1970s. Think of this as a decade of growth and a very important new development in liberation theology in the middle of the decade. This, if you like, is thinking of the early movement. During this time, liberation theologians spoke in terms of radical social theories. They drew on important and sophisticated social analysis in service of theology. In the early years, 1970 to 1973, some of this theory and analysis was quite technical, Some of the readings from this work are a bit hard to follow. They're influenced by Marxist thinking, though Marxism was, and they're very clear to stress this, never more than a tool. It was never the master of liberation theology, but it was a tool that some of them used, particularly in the early 1970s. Then 1975 would come as a critical turning point. And we can sum this up, I suppose, in terms of thinking as a shift from speaking for the poor, which liberation theology had been doing up to this point, to listening to the poor. After 1975, there was much more emphasis on lived experience and more emphasis on articulating this lived experience in accessible ways that the poor themselves could better understand and absorb, rather than other intellectuals and other educated and trained people in academies or other contexts. So this is the period where a richer sense of what was called the preferential option for the poor developed, which would link the political option for the poor in the 1960s now with a methodological option or an epistemological option, a way of knowing. And what this way of knowing it was a sense that the struggles of the oppressed and the experience of the poor were places where God was especially present. So rather than trying to do your theology from the reservoir and resource of sophisticated doctrine and thinking in libraries or in academic discussions, to think instead of drawing your theology from the lived experiences of the poor and making theology accessible back to the lived experiences of the poor. And that was a very significant shift right in the middle of the 1970s. In the 1980s, there would be a decade of maturation, which would be stimulated through some very important dialogues. Internal dialogues within Latin American liberation theology, but also dialogues with liberation and contextual theologies in other places. During this time, there would be an expanded understanding of oppression, what we might now call intersectionality. So linking together one form of oppression, might be class and wealth, with other forms of oppression, race or gender. There was also a deepening sense of spirituality as a necessary energy and guide to shape the political commitments and sustain the social engagement, particularly as liberation theology faced increasing resistance. Now, to my mind, certainly thinking of El Salvador, which is the country I've probably studied the most, some of the most profound work of liberation theology actually comes from this decade, the decade of the 1980s. But it was also the decade in which liberation theology was under the most sustained attack, not just on the ground in terms of the experiences of priests and even bishops in Latin America, but also in an institutional context, facing resistance from the Vatican. Then in the 1990s, we see what is in many ways the end of an era or the end of the movement. Some even talk about the death of liberation theology, though I'll be suggesting to you that it's actually much fairer to speak of it as a decline in the movement, but remaining relevant as a legacy. Francis Fukuyama's 1989 essay and his subsequent 1992 book speaks of the end of history, which he saw as good news, thinking of it in terms of the triumph of Western liberal democracy, the end of political struggle, and a new era in which free market economics would set the new course. There's no question that there have been transitions to notional democracies, the dictatorships and far-right regimes in Latin America, which have been the original backdrop for liberation theology, transitioned to democracies, but these were often only notional. They had the consequence, though, of complicating the political context which liberation theologians had first developed their thought. After 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall, the subsequent collapse of the Soviet Union, political divisions were less clear, even though economic polarization remained stark. Political liberation had less resonance in this context, and there was no similarly powerful language to give expression to the preferential option for the poor and what it might mean in clear terms. So that is a very quick whiz through liberation theology. Let me see if I can advance the slide again. Okay, if you want, let me just see. Let me try and pull out what I think of as some of the most important legacies from this process. First of all, a pastoral concern, the absolute priority of the poor in Christian faith and Christian thinking, and a sense of a serious need for solidarity, not just charity, in relationship with the poor. The terminology of liberation, and particularly the sense that a language such as liberation needs to be thought through at different levels. The political level, the personal, or Gutierrez called it the existential level, so meaning more than just our involvement in politics, our whole human life is what he thought of in terms of what liberation theology offered. It offered liberation to the whole human person, but also, and very importantly, at a theological level, that liberation would be a way of understanding God's relationship with humanity and vice versa. And what was significant in liberation theology is, rather than having different language and terminology to talk about these different dimensions of experience, it suggested that the one word liberation spoke effectively to all three. Equally, and I've already touched on this, the terminology of an option for the poor. The willingness to use social analysis to inform theology, rather than just drawing on and perhaps reformulating Christian doctrine, to bring in a sense, a deeper understanding of social dynamics through social analysis. And with that went a sense that theology didn't always have to take the lead in speaking about a situation. It could be a second step. It could wait to hear what other insights there might be into a situation before speaking theologically. And in some ways, that at a methodological level is one of the biggest shifts and transformations I think that liberation theology offers. Rather than starting by speaking with a theological voice, waiting to hear first what other insights there might be into lived experience, and then thinking through your theology in the light of that. And doing that not just as a head exercise, but through involvement with people in situations of oppression or struggle or poverty, and working with them actively in the theological process. It also offers a wider view of different sorts of oppressions, and it's still working through new understandings of systemic oppression and structural injustice. And epistemology of recognizing God's presence in the struggles and of the poor and oppressed as a privileged place, not as an exclusive place, because God is everywhere, but thinking in particular of how God is revealed in the struggles of the poor and oppressed. And then these last two are both particularly associated with El Salvador, and I'll speak to both of them in a later slide as well. The sense that the crucified God is seen in particular in the crucified people, speaking here in some ways metaphorically of people who were crucified, though Sobrino, who's most associated with this idea, would be quick to say that it's not just a metaphor, that in El Salvador there was a reality to the crucifixion that people experienced. It's not just an abstract metaphor. And then Sobrino's colleague, Ignacio Echeverría, would also talk about the naming of reality. And I'll come back to that in a later slide. Okay, so that was a quick whiz through liberation theology from moment to movement, and in that movement, 10 potential legacies that might help shape thought moving forward. If you're interested in a slightly more elaborate version of that, if you email me here at Otago, I can send you a PDF of, I think it's about 15 pages, which works it out in a bit more detail in a chapter. Or if you're really interested, it's developed at more length in my book, but I'm afraid the book is a little bit expensive. So I would suggest starting with the chapter and seeing what you make of it. Okay, the last two slides are fairly brief, but important. In these, I'm going to invite you to think what you see as the important signs of the times, our times, that these legacies might be applied to. There are three I'm going to offer you, though this is by no means an exclusive or exhaustive list. These are just three which come to my mind at the present time. A slightly longer term historical one, the first one, picking up on what I said earlier. Since 1989, the supposed triumph of the West has led to these notional democracies. What I mean by notional democracy is that in principle, at least, these are democracies, but often within these democracies, they're profoundly non-democratic, perhaps even anti-democratic political forces at work. So they are not the full democracy that would have been hoped for when Fukuyama pronounced the end of history and this great new future that was being moved towards. And in particular, within these flawed political democracies, the market forces have had often a very destructive impact. There's been economic polarization, which has continued. There's been social division as a result of that, both within nation states, but also in global terms between North and South. So that's a sign of the times in terms of the politics and economics, both within countries and globally of our present age. Of course, it being 2020, it would be impossible to talk about signs of the times without talking about the global disruption that has come from COVID. Here in New Zealand, we probably balance a sense of relief and thanks for the leadership there has been on this in New Zealand, whilst appreciating still how many have faced great hardship, and there's still a very uncertain future ahead of us. We also recognise that alongside this genuine hardship that many have faced, particularly in global terms, others have been or will be enormously enriched by COVID. Its disruptive impact will give enormous opportunities for enrichment for a few, whilst leading in all likelihood to hardship for many others. And then thirdly, and in some ways, the even bigger issue that there's a danger COVID distracts attention from, and that's climate change as an ongoing challenge and a threat of global catastrophe, particularly here important for us here in the Pacific. And let's not forget that for both COVID and for climate change, it is the poor and the most vulnerable who are most at risk. And furthermore, it's often women who face the greatest hardships or face the greatest negative consequences from responses to these. So 3 signs of the times. Feel free to add in the blanks and think what else you might name in terms of the situation that we're in and what we're facing in terms of the present and looking to the future. Here, it seems to me, as I draw this to a close, I can offer 3 questions that I think liberation theology might help us usefully pose as we draw from the past to think about facing the present and creating a new future. So first, this idea of naming reality, which I mentioned came from a career in El Salvador. There's a fundamental difference between a faith and a theology which distances us from reality, which takes us into a detached, disconnected, or abstract theological realm, and a theology which turns us to face reality and helps us to name and respond to reality. And so John Sobrino often cites Ignacio Ellacuría for repeatedly stressing the importance in theology of naming reality rather than to distract from reality. And I think that's a really useful touchstone for any theological process. Is it helping us name reality as it is, or is it distracting us and taking us away from reality? Second, where do we see the crucified people and therefore the cross in today's world? And this is very much Sobrino's question. In this place and in this time, where do we see the crucified people? People crucified through unjust structures, or people crucified through violence or other forms of crucifixion. Sobrino drew an important distinction between 2 types of crucified people in El Salvador. Those who were crucified, he called it slowly, through the unjust oppression of being dispossessed of their land, being underpaid, being exploited, who were crucified ultimately through hunger and being ground down, and those who were crucified quickly by bullets or in some other immediately violent way if they rose up against those systems and structures. So Sobrino's notion of the crucified people gives us a very powerful Christological way of thinking about where we see the crucified people in the present and where they might be in the future. And Sobrino offers the strong challenge that the response to the crucified people is not to romanticize their suffering, but to bring them down from the cross. Thirdly, and finally, how can an understanding of the signs of the times, our discernment of those crucified today, call us to new reflection and conversation for creating a new future? How can liberation theology and its insights help us to think more deeply about who we are, think more clearly about what is happening in our times, and work more purposefully towards a new future? I hope that some of what I've sketched will give us tools and resources for thinking about these questions, and I'm looking forward to what strikes you and the insights you have on this in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Hello, as Professor Toombs has said, he now would like to invite questions from both the audience here and possibly the audience online. For the audience here, you need to come and talk into this mic so he can hear you, and those who are joining us by Zoom can hear us. So, Jonathan.
Thank you very much for that, David. My question is a criticism of liberation theology, in that when you talk about the triumph of the West, that is actually a triumph of the theology against which liberation theology railed. And it seems to me that the great failing of liberation theology is it never inspired a successful political movement or a worldwide political movement with any power, authority, or success.
Thanks for that. I think that's a rather harsh judgment on liberation theology. I think it's a fair point in some ways, but I wonder if that's an unfair comparison of liberation theology to either other theologies, philosophies, political movements. I think it is right that has not happened. I'm not sure how fair it is to disproportionately blame liberation theology for that.
I'm Bishop John Osmers, who's living in Lusaka in Zambia and for a short time here in Christchurch. And I'd like to make a comment on the suggestion just made from the floor that liberation theology didn't kind of lead into anything strong politically or for political liberation. And I refer to the way that liberation theology had a very strong effect on many or some theologians and students in the South Africa during the time of apartheid. I speak especially of the University Christian movement, which was a successor to the student Christian movement, where liberation theology and black theology were prime parts of the thinking of the movement, together with women's liberation and education according to the theories of Paulo Freire. And we found that the thinking of liberation theology, which was developed by theologians like Alfred Nolan, led to the black students in particular becoming very aware of themselves as black Christians and developing the theme of black is beautiful. And from that, we find the young people in the 1976 objecting to their education and strongly opposing the forces of the South African police and the army and government to work for a free South Africa. And I found myself living as a priest in Lesotho that the thinking of liberation theology was a tremendous support to these young people as they tried to look for a future for themselves and to work out their understanding of liberation, both as young South Africans and also as Christians. And I refer here again to the Kairos document that some of you here will know, which was, as in your talk, you kind of mentioned the process leading to that, where people looked at their situation and saw theology in terms of state theology, which was supporting the state, according to Romans 13, church theology, which was looking for reconciliation, but for no political change, and liberation itself. And this, I think, was another kind of result coming from the thinking of liberation theology. I'd just like to make a final comment, and that is that in Southern and Central Africa today, the little cell groups of Central America, which was part of liberation theology, have now developed into a pastoral organization of the Catholic Church, where the Catholic Church today no longer sees itself as a church of the congregation, but as a domestic church, where Christians meet in small cell groups in the locations on the farms where they're living, studying the Bible every week and meeting for prayer and also for outreach to the community. And this is a kind of a change from liberation theology to fight for political change to pastoral care, which has a very, very strong effect in the Catholic Church in bringing in many new Christians. I'd just like to say that I'm sorry I've talked for too long, but thank you very much, David, for your talk.
Thank you. I very much appreciate those words. And as you'll be aware, I focus very much on Latin America, but it's absolutely right. Liberation theology in South Africa, or Black liberation theology in South Africa and in other contexts has been, to my mind, very, very important.
Hi, David. I'm Jill Hawkey, and on the CWS board, and thank you for your presentation. I always say that I cut my teeth on the issue of Nicaragua, and as a young person in my early 20s, I was really inspired by liberation theology and understood, I always say I was a child of the Cold War that was brought up to believe that everything that America did was right and everything that Russia did was wrong, until I heard about the struggles of Nicaragua and discovered liberation theology, and I think it probably changed my own theological understanding. So it's music to my ears to listen to you this evening, and I just find it very inspiring. So thank you for your presentation. A question that I have is, I think we really struggle in Aotearoa today with what's happening in our society and the opportunity to really reflect on it theologically. And I don't think there are many spaces where that happens and where that happens well. And I just wonder what you see in your studies and as you talk with people from around the country, and where you see that kind of theological reflection on what's happening within our own country is being done well. Kia ora.
Thanks, Jill. It's a really good question. I've been here nearly 6 years now, coming from Ireland, and my immediate predecessor, Andrew Bradstock, one of the things he said to me is, you'll find a lot of people in Aotearoa, New Zealand, tell you this is a secular country. And it is, I think, a significant sense of the collective identity that New Zealand is secular, and there's definitely a wariness, certainly in a university setting, about theology and theological thought. And I think perhaps the combination of the secular identity as something positive, and it does have positives to it, and the wariness around theology encourages many in the church towards a relatively careful and cautious theological approach. There is, I think, a lack of bold, creative theological thinking. There's more of a readiness to repeat what is known and understood, rather than to break new ground, to be adventurous, to be creative. So for me, the insight of liberation theology, that God can be found in special ways in particular places, is an invitation to new ways of thinking. Aya Korea's insistence that reality is faced, not avoided, and to be suspicious of theological ideas which take you away from reality, that's also very telling. Certainly talking to young people, they will have a suspicion that a lot of what happens in church and a lot of the theological ideas that people are comfortable with are taking away from reality rather than taking towards reality. Now, some of that perception may be unfair, but it's definitely there. And for me, that passage from Aya Korea is a constant reminder that we have to take reality as the starting and end point of theology. We can't use theology as an excuse for abstraction. It has to help us face and deal with the lived experience as it really is. And then the other aspect of liberation theology that I think helps us do that is the principle of starting with that experience. Don't start with theology. Start with lived experience and reflect theologically in the light of that experience. And I have to say that approach to theology does not seem very strong in New Zealand. It may be the circles I mix in universities and theological colleges and perhaps some churches. So it may be I haven't encountered it in other places, but generally I don't see that readiness and willingness to use that theology as a second step. People feel more uncomfortable. People feel more comfortable with the theological traditions and, as it were, certainties that they know, rather than exploring new ways of encountering God in new situations.
Just to follow up, and I especially want to say hello to Mandla, who I saw on the screen. I'm Gillian Southey from Christian World Service staff, and I want to ask a different question, but I think what you've just said is really something I've noticed over the years, the decline. That space has been stronger in the past. But I wonder how much talking about a crucified people and a crucified God has resonance today, because my experience of the world is everybody wants to be a hero, everybody wants to be awesome, and nobody wants to be weak, with the oppressed, poor, the last, or any of those other terms. And because we talk about development all the time, and the challenge I face is I want to talk about powerful people who are poor. It's not their fault they are poor, it's a systemic problem. So how can, does the crucified people fit as a word, terminology?
Yeah, thanks. And it's a great question. And I think there would be limitations in only thinking about the crucified people. But for me, I suppose that's where I've encountered some of the most generative ideas on this. And one of the learnings I've taken from that is actually many people, if you can find ways of opening up the conversation, do experience themselves not as powerful, not as heroic, but as often weak and anxious and hurting in different ways. And the model or the image of the crucified Christ and how that might resonate with a sense of crucified people and how individuals might then identify with that, I find it powerful. It's not the only I think generative theological idea, but we at Otago have just coming to the end of a 3-year project where we've explored the Matthew 25 text, when did we see you naked? And that's a point of supreme vulnerability, which we've connected to crucifixion and the nakedness of Christ on the cross. And it's elicited very strong reactions from people who say that they think in a new way in the light of the work which has been done on this. And some of the boldest international development work that faith-based organizations are involved with is around gender-based violence in countries where there are often very high levels, particularly in conflict areas. And this would be just one idea where I think some of the insights from El Salvador, developed in a particular way, have power to speak to some of the really significant issues that faith-based organizations are working on with Global South partners.
Professor, I'm Dennis Field. I've always taken an interest in liberation theology, and I've got a reflection. Only something as radical as liberation theology could precipitate the breakdown of the Roman Catholic edifice in South America. And that sprung to mind when I read a statement the other day that half of the Roman Catholics in North America voted for Trump.
Kia ora, David. I'm Gaia. As a follow-up, I was going to ask, what's the role of Pope Francis? To me, as an Italian, he seems one of the most progressive leaders we have in Italy, at least. But I think he can play a big role. But at the same time, he's polarizing the church as well.
No great surprise, I suppose. I think Pope Francis has given tremendous leadership in terms of global issues and how religion can speak with a voice of compassion and a concern for justice. There are divisions within the Catholic Church. That there have always been divisions within the Catholic Church. What is perhaps new and unusual is open opposition to the Pope, at least from some individuals. I personally can't help thinking that more conservative voices feel entitled to offer criticism of somebody they see as less conservative than them. If it was the other way around, there would be a different type of reaction to criticism of the Pope. I mean, when I look at the criticism that liberation theologians offered of the Pope, certainly in public, they were always careful to be respectful and acknowledge strengths and not just weaknesses. There's been some criticism from the very early career of Pope Francis as to whether he really did enough to protect some of the Jesuits who were committed to liberation theology in Argentina. I don't know enough to comment on those very early years, but certainly in his time as Pope, he's been very supportive and affirming of the ideas of liberation theology, or at least the underlying principles of liberation theology.
I think we have time for one last question. If there's someone who's got a burning question they wish to ask David Toombs. We haven't heard from any of our people who are joining us by Zoom. It's nice to see you, Manla. Manla was a staff member with CWS. There's Eric is next to him. Eric Park is our relationships coordinator who's based in Auckland. So I'm wondering if any of you have a question.
I have a question. It's around whether there is room for a conversation between liberation theology or those theologians who've come out of that cradle and free market capitalism. And the reason I'm asking it is that my own family reflects both of those ends, kind of socialism and capitalism in one family. And I find that free market capitalists listen to other free market capitalists, and socialists listen to other socialists, and seem to be perplexed by each other a great deal, and don't seem to understand how the other could possibly believe that they have a solution for making the world a better place. Each seems to believe making the world a better place. So has there been a dialogue between the two? Is there a space for a dialogue between the two?
Thanks for that question. It's possible they've been talking past each other. I don't know if you've perhaps suggested that happens in your family as well. And I guess that's part of the dynamic, that it is difficult to hear what somebody else is saying if you're starting at such a radically different point. I mean, I think now there isn't a movement of liberation theology as such to be in any sort of organized dialogue. This is, I suppose, part of the Fukuyama argument that in effect, the shift has been towards a free market or more neoliberal hegemony that takes for granted this is not just the way but the only way of doing things. I think it is important to recognize that from sort of 68 to 75, the engagement of liberation theology with socialism was sort of theoretical and book based. But from 75, it was very much an immersive engagement with the experiences of the poor. It wasn't a theoretical socialism they were engaging with. That is truer of the early period, or at least the early writings. But there, or from 75 at least, it's the experience of poverty that they would draw on, rather than political ideologies. So I think that's at least how they would start to unpack that conversation. Let's look at how that materially affects the poor and their everyday experience and their everyday lives.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for your participation. I shall now ask Jonathan Fletcher to come forward and give a vote of thanks to David Toombs.
Thank you very much, David. Those of us here and those on Zoom, and I suppose Zoom is about the one thing we can thank COVID-19 for. We wouldn't have done this a year ago. I think have found your presentation interesting and inspiring. And I'd have to say that we probably need the inspiration that liberation theology can give us more than ever now. I was hoping that there would be some people would ask you some quick questions about the global problems and climate change, as you hinted could be considered, but it does seem to me that the insights of liberation theology are needed as we look at ways of addressing climate change as a global problem. So I think we will all go away from here inspired by your presentation. And one of the things, this is the 75th anniversary of CWS, and I don't think we should have had to wait 75 years to hear from you. So I might just propose to my fellow board members that we look at having CWS sponsor an annual theological lecture from now on, or at least a 2-yearly theological lecture. Because of the interest that you've generated in this presentation tonight. So on behalf of everybody here, I'd like to ask them to join together in thanking you very much for your